Hey buddy. In Hawara, Egypt, about 100 kilometers south of Giza, just outside of this large oasis region, are the ruins of an ancient underground labyrinth that was once considered one of the ancient wonders of the world. As far as we know, this is the largest monument that ancient Egyptians ever built. It was a multi-leveled maze of tunnels, rooms, and caverns with upwards of 3,000 rooms carved into the bedrock and topped with a massive temple, all decorated and painted with art, hieroglyphs, and statues. This thing was huge. Apparently you could have fit all of the ancient temples of Luxor and Karnak and many of the other temples of Egypt inside of it. According to Greek historians, the Labyrinth of Hawara was 100 times larger than the giant labyrinth of Minoa on the island of Crete. You know, the famous Greek labyrinth that housed the Minotaur. Welcome to another episode of History is a Lie, the series where we have fun discussing some of the enigmas and riddles of history. The Labyrinth of Hawara is believed to have been built around 1800 BC as part of a pyramid complex for Pharaoh Amenemhat III. In the 5th century BC, Greek historian Herodotus described the labyrinth as exceeding all of the efforts and expense of all of Greece's architecture, and even though the pyramids are beyond words, this labyrinth surpassed even the pyramids. I mean, imagine that, an ancient underground labyrinth that rivals the pyramids of Giza. For ancient historians to have had that opinion, this underground labyrinth must have been truly awe-inspiring. It sounds like this thing was the size of a city. Later accounts from people such as Pliny the Elder and Strabo would confirm the scale of this monument and would create the idea that it was a truly glorious structure. The Greeks considered the Egyptian labyrinth of Hawara as a greater achievement than anything that Greece had done. Over time, somehow this labyrinth became lost. It was buried under the sand and nobody knew where it was. Nobody even knew where it was supposed to be. And with no archaeological evidence of its existence, the Labyrinth of Hawara would eventually be considered a myth or a legend for hundreds of years. People doubted that it was even real until Sir Flinders Petrie stumbled upon it in the 1800s when he was excavating the ruins of a Roman settlement. Underneath the settlement, Petrie believed that he had found the foundations of the labyrinth, and he was worried that it had fallen into ruin and was quarried and looted by locals, as so many other megalithic Egyptian sites had been before. But upon further inspection, it would turn out that Petrie had actually found the roof of the labyrinth. The labyrinth was still very much intact in the 1800s and was awaiting exploration. But it's been almost 200 years since then, and there are still no photographs of the labyrinth. We haven't even been able to verify any of the drawings or diagrams that the Greeks put together. And since Petrie, it appears as if there have been no serious archaeological excavations or explorations of the site. All we really have of this site now are a few hand-drawn mock-ups and sketches of a tiny portion of what's believed to be down there. So if the Labyrinth of Hawara is real, and it's genuinely one of the most impressive ancient structures ever constructed in human history, why do so few people actually know about this site? And why have so few modern studies been done to uncover it? I want to stress that it's impossible to oversell the scale of this thing. Even individual aspects of the Hawara labyrinth are impressive feats. Each individual aspect of this labyrinth would have been a monumental undertaking stacked on top of another monumental undertaking. For example, there are giant trapdoor blocks that have never been engaged, about 22 tons each. Directly under the center of the pyramid is a massive 110-ton block of red quartzite that appears to be some kind of sarcophagus or box maybe. The lid of this thing is made up of even larger stones, and then there are even larger stones that make up the cap. It's wild what they built here. It's as if there's something in that box that they never want removed. There are endless features on this site that would each take archaeologists and historians decades to study and to dissect. But unfortunately today, this labyrinth has now been flooded. It's impossible for anybody to get down there, and it's slowly eroding in salty water. I've mentioned in several other Egyptian videos that the Nile River floods every year, and the ancient Egyptians managed to engineer ways to use that flooding to their advantage to irrigate their farmlands. The modern Egyptians, however, have decided that they would prefer that the river remain more stable so that they could maintain a more reliable year-round river level, which practically makes sense. So in the 1960s, the Egyptians installed the Aswan Dam further south on the River Nile, which holds back the floodwaters. So those massive annual floods now take all year long to drain out into the ocean. So even though the river levels don't flood as high as they used to, because they now no longer drain out every year, the water table has raised in that region. Also, that waterway that cuts right through the Hawartha site was actually added closer to the 1860s. It was a canal that was built by the same man who built the Suez Canal, and undoubtedly this canalway is allowing a lot more water to seep into the site than it used to see in antiquity. The water table level in Hawara today is now about 5 meters below the surface, but the labyrinth begins about 9 meters below the surface, which means that the entire Hawara labyrinth is now completely filled with water today. This is easily one of the greatest tragedies in archaeology. It's not likely that we'll ever be able to get down there anytime soon, and with all the corrosion that's being caused by the salty water, by the time we finally do get that thing drained out, most of the temple will be completely unrecognizable. But that doesn't mean that people aren't trying to study the labyrinth. In 2008, Louis de Cordier led the Mataha expedition, where they conducted a massive study of the Hawara site in cooperation with the Egyptian Antiquities Division. His team used ground-penetrating radar to scan the site in an attempt to map out as many of the underground tunnels and caverns as they could. Apparently today you can find some of their research on Internet Archive, but the story is that their findings were heavily suppressed by Zahi Hawass and the Egyptian Antiquities Department for various reasons, many of them likely being political. Since then, a company called Merlin Burrows from the UK has used geoscan satellites to search under the earth as well, and their findings are mind-boggling. Their maps give us an idea of the scale of the site, showing just how deep some of these levels go underground, and just how large some of these chambers are. One of their scans shows that there's a giant metallic object in the center of the labyrinth, something that's completely different from anything else on the site. Really different from anything that we find in Egypt. A 40-meter long metallic tic-tac shaped object that appears to be the centerpiece of the entire labyrinth. If we could actually get to that thing, it would probably be one of the greatest archaeological finds in all of human history. This metallic object is somewhere around 50 or 60 meters below the surface of the earth and is in the center of a giant atrium. God, I wish that we could figure out what this thing is. It's genuinely the most fascinating aspect of the entire labyrinth. Mind-blowing. By the time that Petrie discovered the labyrinth in the 1880s, it had already mostly flooded with salty water and was packed with sand and mud. In his book, 10 Years Digging in Egypt, Petrie described his attempted excavation of the site as a harrowing affair, where they had to chisel through giant granite blocks, they had to dig and crawl through mud, and they even used tools to try to scrape the floor to find artifacts and doorways because the water was too salty to submerge their head underneath. But basically, he had to force his way into the labyrinth by tunneling down into the earth, and his main objective was really just to try to find the main entrance. Today, we know that the main entrance to the labyrinth is on the side of the pyramid, with a walkway leading down underneath. But as I said, nobody can actually enter this space anymore because the current flooding is far too high. You can only really get down a few meters into the passageway before you're met with a wall of water. So what makes this a history is a lie episode? Well, there's a lot of debate about how old the labyrinth actually is. and there's a lot of mystery as to why the general public doesn't seem to even know that the labyrinth exists. As I said at the beginning of the video, modern historians place the construction of the labyrinth at about 1800 BC because that's about the time that the pyramid was built on top. The pyramid was believed to have been built for Pharaoh Amen-Emhat III. However, the pyramid is not really a part of the labyrinth. Certain aspects of the labyrinth seem to line up with the pyramid, like the pyramid is built on top of the main entrance, but it seems more likely that the pyramid was built much later. The biggest clue is the quality of the building material. The remaining core structure of the pyramid is made up entirely of mud bricks, which are somewhere around 40 or 80 pounds each. And when the pyramid was complete, it would have been covered in a smooth limestone casing. But according to Herodotus and almost all of the other ancient explorers that had studied that site, the labyrinth was made up almost entirely of giant granite blocks as well as calcite pillars, which they called marble pillars. Herodotus claimed that the ceilings were made up of the same quality material as the walls, and the walls were covered in carvings, hieroglyphs, and paintings. The pillars were very tall. Another explorer explained on his expedition that the labyrinth was so large that it would have been foolish to enter the site without a guide, otherwise you would get lost and would never return. Pliny the Elder explained that in order to get from the highest level in the labyrinth to just the level that's below it, he had to climb down 90 steps. That's about like 3 or 4 stories difference just between one level and another. And from modern scans, we can tell that there are sections that are much deeper than that. And as I said, Petrie explained that right under the center of the pyramid are a collection of massive stones that are covering a giant 110-ton rose quartzite box that might actually be much heavier than that, maybe upwards of 200 tons. When Strabo talked about the labyrinth, he described it as a palace made up of many palaces. But most interestingly is the way that he described the build quality. He said that the ceiling sections were made up of single large slabs of stone made of the same material as the walls. And he said that the construction was similar to the temple in Abydos that he called the Memnonian. And people are pretty sure that he's talking about the temple in Abydos that we now call the Assyrian. Strabo said that the Memnonian was made in the same way as the labyrinth was built, but they differ because the Memnonian is much more simple in design, which is absolutely wild to hear him describe it this way, because the Memnonian, or the Assyrian as we call it today, is a very complex structure made up of massive granite blocks. Archaeologists are baffled that the ancient Egyptians were able to build the Assyrian, so if it's much more simple than the labyrinth, it boggles the mind to imagine what the labyrinth actually looked like. Like, not just in size, he's saying that the labyrinth is much more impressive in quality as well. Wow. Also, the entire site on the surface of Hawara is completely littered with ancient ruins that are much higher build quality than the pyramid. Excluding the ruins from the Roman settlement, obviously, there's an endless collection of granite blocks scattered across the entire area. But the most glaring issue with the accepted age of the labyrinth comes from Pliny the Elder's account. When he visited the site, Pliny was told by the Egyptians that the labyrinth was 3,600 years old. Pliny the Elder lived in the 1st century BC, and he visited the site somewhere around 50 BC. So according to the 1st century Egyptians, the labyrinth was built sometime in 3,600 BC, which means that the labyrinth could be as much as 5,600 years old today. I know that I said earlier that people believe that Petrie was incorrect, that the temple had fallen into ruin, but as Herodotus explained, there was a part of the labyrinth that was above ground. I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. My personal belief is that whatever was in the top of the labyrinth was quarried and carried away so that the building materials could be used on other constructions during the Roman era, but the tunnels and caverns under the ground were very likely likely built around the same time as the rest of the labyrinth, and likely represent only a small portion of what the labyrinth actually encompassed. The labyrinth almost certainly didn't look anything like these drawings. This one in particular is actually taken from a copper carving that was done in the 1600s based on the description of the labyrinth, but it's merely an artistic extrapolation, giving us the idea of a labyrinth with 12 rooms like Herodotus explained. When you go to the Wikipedia for the Hawara labyrinth, you're not going to find most of this information on the page. The Wikipedia is really pathetic considering how much information we have about this labyrinth, even just from ancient sources, let alone the more contemporary expeditions from people like Petrie. For some reason, there appears to be a good deal of resistance from modern historians and archaeologists to challenge the accepted age of the labyrinth of Hawara, and even more resistance from the Antiquities Department of Egypt. Clearly, they have no interest in exploring this site any further, but really, even if they wanted to, it would be too disrupting to the surrounding cities and towns to lower the water level to allow exploration. Unfortunately, this is going to have to remain a mystery for the rest of our lifetimes. Like I said, one of the greatest archaeological tragedies of all time. I just wanted to thank my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. I also have a Ko-fi account. All of my supporters get access to my videos in advance, as well as access to exclusive content, which includes old unlisted videos. And patrons, as well as Ko-fi members, also get access to the Armored Skeptic Discord server. The links are in the description. Again, thank you so much for your support. I love you guys. You're amazing. So what mysteries could be under Hawara? What could be down there? How impressive could the stonework really be in the Labyrinth of Hawara that it actually rivals the achievements of the pyramids of Giza? Could there be artwork or hieroglyphics down there that completely challenge our modern understanding of human history? Do you think that they might have intentionally flooded the labyrinth to hide this history from us? Let me know in the comments below. All that I'll say is that based on these accounts that I'm reading from ancient Greek and Roman historians, it sounds like this labyrinth was probably not built by the same civilization that built the Great Pyramid. This monument could be very much older. It could hint to a much earlier time in human history when people were able to build much more impressive structures. The Labyrinth of Hawara is a true mystery, and perhaps is the most impressive structure ever built in human history. And barely anybody even knows about it.